The blood-soaked wedding sari that Florida police discovered hidden in the attic of Omar al-Hussein's Tampa home contained not only evidence of the brutal assault on his bride of just 17 days, but also a handwritten letter from Aisha Varma to her sister, confessing her fear that her past relationship in India would eventually be discovered by her husband, who had paid her family $80,000 for what he repeatedly called an untouched bride. The discovery of these items, 6 weeks after Aisha had been admitted to Tampa General Hospital with life-threatening injuries, marked the beginning of an investigation that would expose the dangerous intersection of cultural expectations, arranged marriages, and domestic violence that had transformed a hopeful immigrant's American dream into a nightmare of betrayal, violence, and nearly fatal retribution. Aisha Varma had arrived in Florida on a crisp January morning in 2023, carrying 2 suitcases containing all her worldly possessions and a pharmacy degree from a prestigious university in Pune that she hoped would allow her to build a career in America while fulfilling her family's expectations of a traditional marriage to the successful Jordanian-American businessman they had carefully selected for her. The wedding photographs that decorated Omar al-Hussein's spacious suburban home showed a beaming bride in an elaborate red and gold lehenga, her hands covered in intricate henna patterns, standing beside a husband whose proud smile suggested satisfaction in having acquired not just a beautiful wife but also the respectability and cultural continuity that he believed a traditional marriage would provide to counter the westernization he secretly feared was corrupting his identity. The assault that would later put Omar al-Hussein behind bars and Aisha Varma in intensive care occurred after he discovered text messages on her phone referencing a previous relationship in India, a romantic connection she had desperately tried to hide, knowing that her husband's concept of honor and masculinity was inextricably linked to his belief that he had married a woman who had never been touched by another man. The violence that erupted from this discovery escalated from verbal abuse to physical assault over the course of 7 hours, during which neighbors later reported hearing screams but failed to call police, assuming the sounds were part of a cultural celebration or domestic argument that wasn't their business to interfere with. Detective Maria Lopez of the Tampa Police Department's Special Victims Unit would later describe the Varma case as a perfect storm of cultural silence, misplaced loyalty, and dangerous patriarchal entitlement that had created conditions where a young woman's past became justification for violence, so severe it required 3 surgeries and left permanent physical and psychological scars that would forever alter her relationship with both her homeland and her adopted country. The case would eventually attract international attention, forcing uncomfortable conversations about arranged marriages, cultural expectations of female purity, and the vulnerabilities faced by immigrant women whose legal status and financial security often depend entirely on the men who sponsor their presence in America. The broader impact of Aisha Varma's story extended far beyond her individual trauma to shine light on the hundreds of immigrant women who experience domestic violence each year but remain trapped in abusive marriages due to visa dependencies, financial constraints, cultural pressure, and fear of deportation or family rejection. Statistics from domestic violence organizations revealed that immigrant women typically endure abuse for twice as long as their American-born counterparts before seeking help, a reality that advocates attributed to language barriers, unfamiliarity with legal rights, and cultural taboos against publicly acknowledging family problems or bringing shame to their communities. Priya Varma, Aisha's older sister who remained in India, would later reveal to investigators that she had explicitly advised Aisha to hide her previous relationship, telling her that what happens in India stays in India, and that American men will never understand our ways, so it's better to start fresh and forget the past. This advice, given with protective intentions, ultimately contributed to the secrecy and tension that exploded into violence when the truth emerged through an innocent social media post from a mutual friend that referenced Aisha's former boyfriend during a conversation about university memories. The cultural complexity of the case required special training for the legal professionals involved, with cultural competency experts brought in to help the prosecution team understand the nuances of honor-based violence and the particular pressures faced by women from conservative South Asian and Middle Eastern backgrounds without falling into stereotypes or cultural generalizations that might prejudice the jury against entire communities. The case would eventually become part of training materials for police departments across Florida on recognizing and responding to culturally specific forms of domestic abuse that might otherwise be misunderstood or inadequately addressed by standard intervention protocols. Imam Khalid Rahman of the Islamic Center of Tampa played a pivotal role in shifting community perception of the case by publicly condemning Omar's actions as completely contrary to Islamic teachings and emphasizing that no cultural or religious tradition justifies violence against women, regardless of any perceived dishonor or betrayal. His intervention helped counter the attempts by Omar's defense team to frame the assault as a culturally understandable, if regrettable, response to provocation rather than a criminal act deserving serious punishment under American law. The psychological evaluation of Omar al-Hussein conducted while he awaited trial revealed a man whose sense of identity and masculinity had been profoundly shaped by cultural narratives about honor, purity, and patriarchal authority, creating a fragile ego structure that interpreted his wife's past relationship as not merely a personal disappointment, but an existential threat to his manhood and social standing that required violent assertion of control to restore. This analysis would later inform broader discussions about how cultural expectations of masculinity can become destructive when they entitle men to control women's bodies and histories, while denying them basic autonomy and humanity. Aisha Varma's slow recovery in the hospital was complicated by the isolation she experienced as an immigrant whose family remained thousands of miles away in India, reluctant to travel to America due to both financial constraints and the perceived shame they believed her situation had brought upon them. The cultural victim blaming that occurred within segments of both the Indian and Arab American communities added another layer of trauma, with some community members suggesting that she should have been honest before the marriage, while simultaneously acknowledging that such honesty would likely have prevented the match from occurring at all, trapping her in an impossible situation where both honesty and deception led to punishment. The arranged marriage between Aisha Varma and Omar al-Hussein had been celebrated by both families as a perfect example of modern cultural bridge building, combining the traditional values of careful family selection with the cosmopolitan reality of a global diaspora where communities from different regions found common ground in shared conservative values and aspirations for economic prosperity in America. The elaborate wedding ceremonies held in both Pune and Tampa featured traditional rituals, extravagant gifts, and public demonstrations of family unity that masked the private anxieties experienced by a bride who worried that her past would eventually undermine her future happiness. The courtship process that led to the marriage had been carefully orchestrated by both families, with initial meetings conducted via video calls where relatives were always present, followed by a chaperoned 2-week visit where Omar traveled to India to meet Aisha in person under the watchful eyes of her parents and extended family. These structured interactions created an artificial environment where both parties presented idealized versions of themselves, with Aisha carefully avoiding any mention of her previous relationship with a university classmate that had ended a year before the matchmaking process began, and Omar concealing the controlling tendencies that had contributed to the failure of his previous romantic relationships with American women who had rejected his traditional expectations. The financial arrangements that accompanied the marriage included a formal dowry presented by Aisha's family, consisting of gold jewelry and cash valued at approximately $30,000, as well as an informal payment from Omar to her family that was described as a gift, but functioned as what Aisha would later describe in her victim impact statement as a purchase price for a commodity that was expected to meet specific quality standards, namely virginity and complete submission. These financial entanglements created a situation where Aisha felt that rejecting the marriage or revealing her past would constitute not just personal failure, but also financial catastrophe for her family who had invested their savings in securing what they viewed as an advantageous match with a successful American businessman. The immigration process that brought Aisha to America illustrated the precarious position of women who enter the country on spousal visas, with her legal status, economic security, and ability to remain in the United States entirely dependent on the continuation of her marriage to Omar and his willingness to complete the necessary paperwork and financial sponsorship requirements. This dependency created a fundamental power imbalance that Omar exploited through subtle reminders that he could withdraw his support at any time effectively stranding her in a foreign country without legal status or means of supporting herself if she failed to meet his expectations as a wife. The early weeks of their marriage in Florida revealed troubling patterns that Aisha initially dismissed as cultural differences or adjustment difficulties, including Omar's insistence on controlling her schedule, monitoring her phone communications, limiting her contact with potential American friends who might corrupt her with Western values, and expressing disapproval of clothing or makeup that he considered too revealing or attention-seeking. These controlling behaviors escalated gradually, following a pattern that domestic violence experts would later identify as consistent with the establishment of coercive control that typically precedes physical violence in abusive relationships. Aisha's enrollment in a certification program that would allow her to practice pharmacy in Florida initially seemed like evidence of Omar's support for her professional development, but his subsequent behaviors, questioning why she needed to study so late, expressing suspicion about male classmates, checking her location throughout the day, and creating scheduling conflicts that made it difficult for her to attend study groups, revealed that his apparent support masked a deeper discomfort with her potential independence and integration into American professional culture. This contradiction between stated support and undermining behaviors created constant cognitive dissonance for Aisha, who struggled to reconcile the public image of a progressive, supportive husband with the private reality of escalating control. The cultural isolation that Aisha experienced in Tampa was intensified by Omar's selective approach to community integration, encouraging connections with conservative families from Middle Eastern backgrounds, while discouraging relationships with both Indian Americans who might share cultural references from her past and progressive Americans who might question traditional gender dynamics. This careful curation of their social circle created an environment where the values and expectations that enabled his controlling behavior were constantly reinforced, while potential sources of alternative perspectives or support were systematically excluded, effectively surrounding Aisha with people who would be unlikely to recognize or intervene in the developing abuse. The pressure on Aisha to conceive a child began almost immediately after the wedding, with Omar's family regularly inquiring about pregnancy news and suggesting fertility interventions when months passed without conception. This pressure reflected not only cultural expectations about the centrality of motherhood to female identity, but also what domestic violence experts recognize as a common tactic in abusive relationships, using pregnancy and children to further bind victims to their abusers through both emotional ties and practical dependencies that make escape more difficult. Aisha's private relief each month when her period arrived, despite her public performance of disappointment, revealed her unconscious recognition that something was fundamentally wrong in the relationship even before the violence became explicit. The discovery that shattered the fragile peace of their marriage occurred when a university friend from Pune posted a comment on one of Aisha's social media photos, referencing her ex-boyfriend Vikram and joking about a memorable incident from their college days. The comment, visible for less than an hour before Aisha noticed and deleted it, was nonetheless seen by Omar, who had been monitoring her online activities and immediately confronted her with what he perceived as evidence of deliberate deception and personal betrayal that threatened his honor, masculinity, and standing in the community. His initial reaction, cold, controlled fury rather than immediate violence, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the confrontation, as Aisha watched him methodically lock doors, disconnect the home's landline, and confiscate her mobile phone while telling her calmly that they needed to discuss what kind of woman I really married. The assault that followed lasted 7 hours, beginning with psychological torture, as Omar forced Aisha to detail every aspect of her previous relationship while he recorded her confession, then escalating to physical violence that included beating her with his fists and a leather belt, cutting off chunks of her hair as symbolic punishment for deception, and finally the most severe attack in which he strangled her until she lost consciousness and then continued beating her unconscious body, stopping only when his own exhaustion overcame his rage. The brutality of the attack was later documented in medical reports that cataloged 3 broken ribs, a fractured eye socket, internal bleeding requiring emergency surgery, strangulation marks consistent with multiple near-fatal choking episodes, and defensive wounds on her arms and hands that testified to her desperate attempts to protect herself during the prolonged assault. The emergency room doctors who received Aisha Varma at Tampa General Hospital initially recorded her case as a suspected car accident based on the explanation provided by Omar Al-Hussein, who had finally driven her to the hospital when her injuries appeared life-threatening, telling medical staff that she had been thrown from the vehicle during a collision that had mysteriously left him uninjured and produced no damage to his car. The inconsistency between the presented scenario and Aisha's injuries, particularly the patterned bruising consistent with belt marks and the distinctive bilateral bruising around her neck, characteristic of manual strangulation rather than seatbelt trauma, immediately raised suspicions among medical personnel trained to recognize domestic violence, triggering a mandatory report to law enforcement that brought Detective Maria Lopez into a case that would consume her professional attention for the next 18 months. The initial police investigation faced significant challenges, beginning with Aisha's medically induced coma that prevented her from providing testimony, Omar's careful construction of an accident narrative that he maintained with unwavering confidence during preliminary questioning, and the absence of witnesses, despite the prolonged nature of the assault. The breakthrough came when the forensic examination of the couple's home, initially conducted with Omar's confident permission based on his belief that he had thoroughly cleaned all evidence, revealed microscopic blood spatter in patterns inconsistent with normal household activities and completely inconsistent with his claim that Aisha had left the house healthy and uninjured before her alleged accident. The discovery of the blood-soaked wedding sari carefully hidden in the attic, wrapped in plastic with Aisha's letter to her sister placed inside the fabric folds, provided the physical evidence needed to arrest Omar for attempted murder and domestic assault, though his immediate release on bail raised serious concerns among domestic violence advocates about the potential for witness intimidation or further violence. The letter itself became crucial evidence, as it not only documented Aisha's fears about her husband discovering her past, but also described earlier incidents of controlling behavior and verbal abuse that established a pattern of escalation consistent with domestic violence. Research, contradicting the defense's later attempts to frame the assault as an isolated incident prompted by extreme provocation. The cultural dimensions of the case complicated the investigation, with initial reluctance from members of both the Indian and Arab American communities to cooperate with authorities based on concerns about perpetuating negative stereotypes, fear of increased discrimination against their communities, and traditional preferences for handling family matters privately, rather than through the criminal justice system. This reluctance began to shift when Imam Khalid Rahman made his public statement condemning the violence and emphasizing that true religious and cultural values protected women's safety rather than men's sense of honor, opening space for community members to support the investigation without feeling they were betraying cultural solidarity. The forensic analysis of digital evidence recovered from the couple's computers and phones revealed months of escalating control, with Omar using tracking software to monitor Aisha's movements, reviewing her search history daily, recording her phone conversations without her knowledge, and maintaining detailed notes about perceived infractions of his expectations, ranging from spoke too familiarly with male pharmacy classmate to wore makeup that was unnecessarily attractive for a simple shopping trip. This documentation of obsessive control provided prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and established that the violence was part of a pattern rather than an impulsive reaction, significantly strengthening the case against him while contradicting cultural narratives about honor-based violence as an understandable emotional response. The medical treatment required to address Aisha's injuries included 3 separate surgeries: 1 emergency procedure to address internal bleeding, a second operation to repair her fractured orbital bone, and a later reconstructive surgery to address damage to her nasal passage that impaired her breathing, along with extensive physical therapy, treatment for traumatic brain injury resulting from oxygen deprivation during strangulation, and dental work to repair broken teeth. The extensive medical documentation of her injuries, including detailed photographs that would later be presented to the jury, created an irrefutable record of violence that contradicted defense attempts to minimize the severity of the assault or suggest that her injuries were exaggerated for sympathy or financial compensation. The psychological trauma that accompanied Aisha's physical injuries manifested in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that included nightmares, hypervigilance, dissociative episodes triggered by certain sounds or smells associated with the assault, and panic attacks when encountering men who physically resembled her husband. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of her treatment documented how the betrayal of trust by someone who was supposed to protect her, combined with the isolation of being in a foreign country without family support, created particularly severe trauma that was further complicated by cultural shame and fear of community judgment that initially made her reluctant to cooperate fully with the prosecution, despite her physical evidence of the abuse she had suffered. Omar al-Hussein's defense strategy evolved as the evidence against him mounted, moving from complete denial and the accident explanation to an admission of excessive discipline that his attorneys attempted to frame as a culturally contextual response to extreme provocation that should be understood through the lens of cultural difference rather than American legal standards. This defense strategy caused significant controversy within the diverse cultural communities of Tampa, with community leaders like Imam Rahman publicly rejecting the implication that cultural background or religious beliefs could justify or excuse domestic violence, while others privately expressed concern that cultural explanations might actually reinforce harmful stereotypes while providing legal cover for abusers. The international dimensions of the case became apparent when Aisha's family in India initially pressured her to reconcile with Omar and withdraw her cooperation with prosecutors, prioritizing family honor and financial stability over her personal safety in ways that reflected deeply internalized cultural values about marriage permanence and the primacy of family reputation. This pressure, conveyed through emotional phone calls and messages that alternated between expressions of concern for her well-being and explicit statements about the shame her situation was bringing to the family, created additional psychological stress during her physical recovery and complicated her relationship with the legal system that was attempting to protect her and hold her abuser accountable. The advocacy organization that eventually provided crucial support for Aisha during her recovery and the legal proceedings was Sanctuary for Immigrant Survivors, a Tampa nonprofit specializing in supporting domestic violence victims from diverse cultural backgrounds through culturally informed services, including safe housing, legal advocacy, immigration assistance, and therapy from counselors familiar with the specific challenges faced by women navigating both trauma and cultural displacement. The organization's intervention included helping Aisha apply for a U visa that would allow her to remain legally in the United States, independent of her relationship with Omar, providing a crucial pathway to autonomy that began to shift the fundamental power dynamic that had made her vulnerable to abuse. The media coverage of the case revealed troubling patterns in how domestic violence against immigrant women was portrayed, with some outlets focusing excessively on cultural differences in ways that bordered on exoticism or reinforced stereotypes, while others avoided cultural context entirely in ways that failed to address the specific vulnerabilities and barriers faced by women navigating both cultural expectations and American legal systems. The most thoughtful coverage came from journalists who worked closely with cultural consultants and domestic violence experts to provide nuanced reporting that recognized how universal patterns of power and control manifest in culturally specific ways, without reducing complex human dynamics to simplistic cultural determinism or reinforcing harmful stereotypes about particular communities. The criminal trial of Omar al-Hussein began 11 months after the assault, following multiple defense motions for continuance that domestic violence advocates recognized as a common tactic designed to exhaust victims' emotional resources and financial capacity to remain engaged with lengthy legal proceedings. The courtroom itself became a space of cultural negotiation, with the judge making specific rulings about the admissibility of cultural context, evidence that allowed for explanation of relevant cultural factors without permitting cultural relativism to undermine the universal application of laws against domestic violence, striking a difficult balance that recognized cultural complexity while maintaining clear legal standards about unacceptable conduct regardless of cultural background. The prosecution team, led by Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Williams, built their case around three core elements: the extensive physical evidence, including medical documentation of Aisha's injuries, forensic analysis of blood patterns in the home, and the hidden wedding sari, the digital evidence showing patterns of controlling behavior and premeditation. and expert testimony from both medical professionals and cultural specialists who could help the jury understand the dynamics of domestic violence within specific cultural contexts without excusing or minimizing the criminal nature of the assault. This multifaceted approach was designed to address both legal requirements for proving attempted murder and aggravated assault charges, while also educating the jury about the complex realities of domestic violence beyond simplistic narratives of isolated incidents or sudden passion. The defense strategy centered on attempting to establish reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations for Aisha's injuries, questioning the reliability of her testimony based on her admitted deception about her past relationship, and introducing cultural context experts who framed Omar's actions as an extreme but culturally understandable response to what was characterized as a fundamental breach of marriage contracts within certain cultural traditions. This approach faced significant challenges from both the prosecution's cross-examination, which established that no legitimate cultural or religious tradition condones life-threatening violence regardless of provocation, and from community leaders like Imam Rahman, who testified that such violence contradicted rather than expressed authentic cultural values. The testimony provided by Aisha Varma during the trial required extraordinary courage, as she was required to describe intimate details of both her previous relationship and the assault while facing her abuser in court, navigating cultural shame about discussing such matters publicly, and enduring aggressive cross-examination by defense attorneys attempting to portray her as dishonest and manipulative based on her concealment of her past. Her composed and consistent testimony, despite these pressures, was later credited by jurors as particularly convincing evidence of her credibility, especially when contrasted with Omar's alternately defiant and self-pitying demeanor during his own testimony. The expert testimony on cultural context presented by Dr. Samina Khan, a specialist in gender-based violence in South Asian and Middle Eastern communities, provided the jury with crucial information about how universal patterns of domestic violence manifest in culturally specific ways, without suggesting that culture either caused or excused the violence. Her careful explanation of how abusers often exploit and distort cultural values to justify control and violence, while actual cultural leaders and religious authorities consistently condemn such exploitation, helped jurors understand the case in its proper context, while avoiding both cultural relativism and stereotyping entire communities based on individual criminal behavior. The forensic evidence presented during the trial included detailed analysis of blood spatter patterns throughout the house that contradicted Omar's claim of a single confrontation in one room, instead revealing evidence of a prolonged assault that had moved through multiple areas of the home over several hours, consistent with Aisha's testimony about being pursued from room to room as she attempted to escape the violence. This physical evidence, combined with the medical examiner's testimony about the timing and progression of different injuries, established a timeline of escalating violence that contradicted defense claims about a brief loss of control and instead supported prosecution arguments about sustained, deliberate assault with intent to cause serious harm or death. The digital evidence recovered from Omar's devices revealed not only his surveillance of Aisha but also research he had conducted both before and after the assault, including searches for legal consequences domestic violence Florida, how to clean blood evidence, and countries without extradition treaties with U.S., which prosecutors presented as evidence of both premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Particularly damning was a series of text messages he had sent to a male friend in the weeks before the assault, expressing suspicion about Aisha's past and stating that, "If I discover she has lied to me about being pure, I will make her regret being born," directly contradicting his court testimony that the violence had been an unplanned response to sudden discovery. The community response to the trial reflected complex cultural negotiation, with some members of both Indian and Arab American communities privately expressing concern that public airing of the case reinforced negative stereotypes, while others, particularly younger community members and women, organized support campaigns for Aisha and used the case as an opportunity to address domestic violence within their communities through educational forums, support groups, and renewed commitment to identifying and intervening in abuse situations before they escalated to life-threatening violence. This generational and gender divide within communities revealed evolving perspectives on both cultural preservation and adaptation in diaspora contexts. The immigration consequences of the case extended beyond Aisha's individual situation to highlight systemic issues faced by immigrant women in abusive relationships, including visa dependencies that create power imbalances, language and cultural barriers to accessing services, and fears about deportation that abusers routinely exploit to maintain control. Aisha's application for a U visa, available to victims of certain crimes who cooperate with law enforcement, represented one pathway to independence, though advocates pointed out that such protections remained unavailable to many victims who were unable or unwilling to report abuse, or whose cases did not result in criminal charges due to evidence limitations or prosecutorial discretion. The cultural expertise provided during the trial by Imam Rahman was particularly significant in countering defense attempts to use religious and cultural traditions as mitigating factors, with his testimony clearly establishing that while certain cultural traditions might place high value on female chastity before marriage, no legitimate interpretation of Islamic teachings or Middle Eastern cultural values condoned violence as an appropriate response to discovering a wife's past relationship. His moral authority within the community, combined with his scholarly credentials, made his rejection of cultural defenses particularly powerful for jurors who might otherwise have been uncertain about navigating unfamiliar cultural terrain while applying American legal standards. The psychological evaluation of Omar al-Hussein presented during the trial revealed a personality structure organized around rigid concepts of honor, control, and patriarchal authority, with particular sensitivity to perceived challenges to his masculinity or public standing. The evaluation documented how his psychological rigidity created vulnerability to extreme responses when faced with information that contradicted his self-concept or threatened his sense of control, explaining, though not excusing, the eruption of violence when Aisha's past relationship disrupted his narrative about having secured a pure wife who would validate his standing in the community and fulfill his idealized vision of traditional marriage uncorrupted by Western influences or female independence. The jury's verdict of guilty on all charges, attempted second-degree murder, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, his belt, and false imprisonment came after just 7 hours of deliberation, a relatively quick decision that reflected the strength of the evidence presented by the prosecution and the jury's rejection of cultural defenses as mitigating factors for violence that had nearly proven fatal. The sentencing hearing that followed 3 weeks later would become another forum for cultural negotiation, with Omar's family and some community members submitting letters requesting leniency based on cultural context, while domestic violence advocates and other community leaders, including Imam Rahman, submitted statements emphasizing that genuine respect for cultural diversity required holding individuals accountable to universal standards, prohibiting violence regardless of cultural background. The victim impact statement that Aisha delivered during the sentencing hearing provided powerful testimony about both the physical and psychological consequences of the assault, describing her ongoing pain, permanent facial scarring, nightmares, and fear of forming new relationships, while also addressing the cultural dimensions of her experience. I have lost not only my health and sense of safety, but also my connection to my family, who believe I have brought shame upon them, and my place within a community that should have protected me, but instead made excuses for violence in the name of traditions that were never meant to justify cruelty. Her statement directly challenged cultural narratives about honor by asserting that there is no honor in a man who beats a woman unconscious for having lived a full life before meeting him, only cowardice disguised as cultural pride. The sentence imposed by Judge Caroline Martinez, 15 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of probation, with mandatory completion of a batterer's intervention program specifically designed for perpetrators from traditional cultural backgrounds, reflected both the severity of the crime and recognition of how cultural factors had contributed to the perpetrator's sense of entitlement and justification without accepting those factors as excusing or mitigating the violence itself. The judge's remarks during sentencing explicitly addressed the cultural dimensions of the case. American law respects cultural diversity, but maintains that certain standards apply universally regardless of cultural background, including the prohibition against domestic violence and the right of all people to physical safety, regardless of gender, marital status, or past conduct. The civil lawsuit that Aisha subsequently filed against Omar sought damages for medical expenses, ongoing therapy costs, lost income during her recovery period, and pain and suffering resulting from the assault. The civil proceedings revealed the financial control that had characterized their marriage, with evidence that Omar had systematically prevented Aisha from establishing independent bank accounts, credit history, or financial resources that would have made it possible for her to leave the relationship before violence occurred, a pattern that domestic violence experts identified as economic abuse designed to maintain dependency and prevent escape from escalating control and eventual physical violence. The broader impact of the case on Tampa's immigrant communities included increased attention to domestic violence prevention and intervention, with cultural and religious organizations establishing new educational programs, support groups, and reporting mechanisms designed to address abuse before it escalated to crisis levels. Particularly significant was the establishment of a cultural competency training program for local law enforcement, healthcare providers, and social service agencies, developed in consultation with diverse community leaders to ensure that professionals could recognize and respond appropriately to domestic violence cases involving cultural factors without either cultural stereotyping or cultural relativism that might leave victims unprotected. The international attention that the case received prompted discussions in both India and Jordan about the cultural expectations surrounding arranged marriages, female sexuality, and concepts of family honor that could create conditions for abuse when distorted or exploited by controlling individuals. Media coverage in India particularly focused on the dangers of international arranged marriages, where brides were sent to foreign countries with limited knowledge of their legal rights or support systems, leading to calls for enhanced pre-marriage counseling, better background checks on potential grooms, and development of international support networks for women in diaspora communities who might face abuse or exploitation. The psychological recovery process for Aisha included not only traditional therapy for trauma, but also culturally informed counseling that helped her navigate the complex intersection of personal healing, cultural identity, family relationships, and community belonging in the aftermath of violence that had been partly justified through distortions of her own cultural traditions. This specialized approach recognized that effective trauma recovery for women from traditional backgrounds needed to address not only individual psychological impacts, but also cultural meanings, spiritual dimensions, and communal relationships that formed essential components of identity and well-being, requiring therapeutic models that bridged Western individualistic approaches with more collectivist cultural frameworks. The immigration advocacy that emerged from the case focused on systematic vulnerabilities created by visa policies that tied women's legal status to marriage, creating power imbalances that abusers could exploit to control and intimidate immigrant spouses. Organizations like the Florida Immigrant Coalition used Aisha's case to advocate for expanded protections for immigrant victims of domestic violence, including streamlined access to U visas, work authorization during pending immigration cases, and enhanced training for immigration officials to recognize and appropriately respond to cases involving domestic violence, rather than treating them primarily as immigration enforcement matters. The media narrative surrounding the case evolved over time, with initial reporting often focusing on sensationalized aspects of honor violence in ways that risked reinforcing stereotypes about particular communities, gradually shifting toward more nuanced coverage that placed the case in the context of universal patterns of domestic violence, while acknowledging specific cultural factors that shaped both the violence itself and community responses to it. This evolution reflected growing recognition among journalists about responsibilities for culturally sensitive reporting that neither exoticized violence in immigrant communities nor ignored relevant cultural dimensions that affect victims' experiences and access to support. The legal precedents established through both the criminal prosecution and civil litigation created important frameworks for addressing future cases involving cultural defenses for domestic violence, with the court records documenting judicial reasoning that recognized cultural context as relevant for understanding behavior without accepting culture as excusing criminal conduct. These precedents would subsequently be cited in other cases involving attempts to use cultural or religious justifications for gender-based violence, establishing that, while American courts respect cultural diversity, this respect does not extend to accepting cultural relativism that would create different standards of protection based on victims' cultural backgrounds. The long-term consequences of the case for Omar al-Hussein extended beyond his prison sentence to include permanent damage to his business and financial standing, with the civil judgment against him eventually forcing the sale of his car dealership to satisfy the damages awarded to Aisha, as well as immigration consequences that would likely include deportation to Jordan after completion of his sentence, despite having lived in the United States for over a decade. These severe and lasting consequences sent a powerful message about accountability that contradicted beliefs sometimes held in immigrant communities that American authorities would not fully enforce laws against domestic violence. Perpetrators were from minority cultural backgrounds or when violence occurred within marriage. The prison experience of Omar al-Hussein revealed complex cultural negotiations within the correctional system, as he initially attempted to present himself to other inmates and staff as a political prisoner unfairly punished for following his cultural traditions, a narrative that gained little traction even among other Middle Eastern inmates, who generally rejected his attempts to use shared cultural background to justify violence that most viewed as excessive and contrary to authentic religious teachings. His gradual isolation within the prison population reflected broader community rejection of attempts to use cultural defenses for domestic violence, with even traditionally minded inmates making clear distinctions between cultural pride and violent abuse. The psychological treatment program that Omar was required to complete as part of his sentence was specifically designed for perpetrators from traditional cultural backgrounds, addressing how cultural concepts of masculinity, honor, and family authority could become distorted to justify control and violence, while also emphasizing alternative cultural narratives and religious interpretations that supported respectful relationships, nonviolence, and women's basic human dignity. The program's approach recognized that effective intervention required engaging with, rather than ignoring cultural frameworks, helping participants distinguish between legitimate cultural traditions and distortions that enabled abuse, while developing alternative models of masculinity that maintained cultural identity without requiring domination or control of women. The recovery journey for Aisha Varma included not only physical healing and psychological treatment, but also the challenging process of rebuilding her life in a country where she had originally expected to establish herself as part of a couple, but now needed to create an independent identity, social network, and career path as a single woman navigating both American culture and her connections to Indian heritage. The support services that proved most valuable during this transition were those that recognized her need to maintain cultural connections while rejecting cultural expectations that had contributed to her vulnerability, helping her distinguish between aspects of her heritage that provided strength and meaning versus those that had been weaponized against her to justify violence and control. The educational initiatives that grew from Aisha's case included the development of a comprehensive training program for healthcare providers on recognizing and responding to domestic violence in culturally diverse communities, with particular attention to signs of abuse that might be missed by providers unfamiliar with specific cultural contexts or manifestations of control that differed from typical patterns in mainstream American relationships. The program, developed in partnership between Tampa General Hospital and Sanctuary for Immigrant Survivors, emphasized how universal patterns of power and control manifest in culturally specific ways, while providing practical guidance for overcoming barriers to intervention, including language differences, immigration concerns, and cultural taboos about discussing family problems with outsiders. The community healing process within Tampa's diverse immigrant populations involved difficult conversations about cultural adaptation, gender expectations, and the balance between preserving valuable traditions while rejecting aspects of cultural heritage that could enable abuse when removed from traditional regulatory systems that had historically provided some protection for women within otherwise patriarchal structures. These conversations, facilitated through forums organized by cultural and religious organizations with support from domestic violence experts, created space for community members to address harmful dynamics without feeling their entire cultural identity was being attacked or devalued, focusing on strengthening protective factors within communities while identifying and challenging norms that increased vulnerability to abuse. The policy changes that emerged at local and state levels included enhanced training requirements for police officers responding to domestic violence calls in culturally diverse communities, improved language access protocols for courts and service agencies, and development of specialized risk assessment tools that incorporated awareness of culture-specific risk factors and manifestations of control that might be overlooked in standard evaluation procedures. These systematic improvements reflected growing recognition that effective response to domestic violence required institutional adaptation to community diversity, rather than expecting diverse populations to conform entirely to systems designed primarily for mainstream American cultural contexts. The media guidelines developed by domestic violence organizations in partnership with cultural community leaders established frameworks for reporting on cases involving immigrant victims that balanced public education about the realities of domestic violence with respect for cultural communities, avoiding both harmful stereotyping and cultural relativism, while providing necessary context for understanding how universal patterns of abuse manifest in culturally specific ways. These guidelines emphasize the importance of including diverse voices within coverage, particularly highlighting perspectives from women within affected communities, rather than positioning all members of cultural groups as either potential perpetrators or helpless victims without agency or internal resources for addressing harmful dynamics. The educational curriculum developed for Florida high schools, based partly on lessons from Aisha's case, focused on healthy relationships across cultural contexts, helping young people recognize warning signs of controlling behavior, while also navigating complex cultural expectations about gender, relationships, and family obligations. The program, designed with input from diverse cultural consultants to ensure relevance for students from various backgrounds, emphasized universal rights to safety and respect within relationships, while acknowledging different cultural approaches to courtship, marriage, and family formation, creating space for cultural pride, while establishing clear boundaries around behaviors that constituted abuse, regardless of cultural context. The international cooperation that developed between domestic violence organizations in the United States, India, and several Middle Eastern countries in the aftermath of the case established new protocols for supporting women in international marriages, including better pre-departure counseling about legal rights in destination countries, development of international support networks connecting women from similar cultural backgrounds across national boundaries, and improved communication between service providers across countries to facilitate safety planning for women considering returning to their countries of origin after experiencing abuse abroad. These international partnerships recognized that effective intervention required understanding both the cultural contexts that shaped women's options and the transnational nature of modern family relationships in diaspora communities. The 2-year anniversary of Aisha Varma's assault marked significant transformation not only in her personal life, but also in Tampa's approach to domestic violence in diverse communities, with the establishment of the Cultural Bridge Initiative, bringing together religious leaders, cultural organizations, domestic violence experts, and law enforcement to develop comprehensive strategies for prevention, intervention, and survivor support that respected cultural diversity, while maintaining unwavering commitment to safety and accountability for abuse. The initiative's achievements included development of culturally specific support groups for survivors from various backgrounds, training programs for cultural and religious leaders on appropriate responses to abuse disclosures, and community education campaigns, addressing harmful myths about domestic violence that existed across different cultural contexts. The professional journey that Aisha embarked upon following her recovery included completion of her pharmacy certification, employment at a community health clinic serving primarily immigrant populations, and eventual development of specialized training for healthcare providers on screening for domestic violence among patients from diverse cultural backgrounds. Her ability to transform personal trauma into professional expertise that benefited other vulnerable women represented a powerful form of healing and reclamation of agency, though she remained careful to protect her privacy and emotional well-being by controlling how and when she shared her personal story, establishing boundaries that allowed her to be an advocate without becoming defined solely by her victim status. The relationships that Aisha developed with other survivors through support groups and advocacy work became an essential part of her healing process, creating connections based on shared experience that partially compensated for the family relationships damaged or lost in the aftermath of the assault, when her parents and extended family in India continued to express ambivalence about her decision to pursue criminal charges rather than attempting reconciliation with Omar. These survivor networks provided not only emotional support but also practical assistance with navigating complex systems, including the criminal justice process, immigration proceedings, healthcare, and housing, creating community resources that address the specific challenges faced by immigrant women rebuilding lives after violence. The legal reforms advocated by Aisha and other survivors included enhanced protections for immigrant victims, expanding eligibility for U visas beyond those whose cases resulted in criminal prosecution to include victims who cooperated with law enforcement even when cases did not proceed to trial due to evidence limitations or prosecutorial discretion. These advocacy efforts highlighted how immigration policies created particular vulnerabilities for women dependent on spousal sponsorship, urging systemic changes to address power imbalances, while also developing practical interventions including Know Your Rights, education for immigrant women, and training for immigration officials on identifying and appropriately responding to domestic violence cases rather than treating them primarily as immigration enforcement matters. The cultural conversations about gender expectations, relationship dynamics, and definitions of honor that occurred within Tampa's Indian and Middle Eastern communities revealed generational divides, with younger community members often more willing to question traditional gender roles and express support for abuse victims, while some older generation members continued to prioritize family privacy, marriage preservation, and cultural continuity, even in situations involving documented abuse. These intergenerational dialogues created both tension and opportunity, with young community leaders emerging as important bridges between traditional values and evolving perspectives on gender equality, personal autonomy, and violence prevention. The religious leadership that emerged from progressive elements within both Hindu and Muslim communities provided crucial theological frameworks for challenging abuse while maintaining cultural and spiritual identity, with religious scholars articulating interpretations of sacred texts and traditions that emphasized respect, compassion, and nonviolence in family relationships, while rejecting distortions that had been used to justify control or abuse of women. This religious engagement was particularly important in communities where faith formed a central component of identity and moral authority, providing pathways for rejecting abusive behaviors without feeling that such rejection required abandonment of cultural or religious heritage that provided important sources of meaning, connection, and continuity. The specialized Batterer Intervention Program developed for perpetrators from traditional cultural backgrounds, initially created for Omar's rehabilitation, but subsequently expanded to serve other offenders, represented an innovative approach to accountability that engaged directly with cultural narratives about masculinity, honor, and family authority that had enabled abuse when distorted or taken to extremes. The program's approach, developed by clinicians with extensive experience in both domestic violence intervention and cross-cultural psychology, recognized that effective behavior change required addressing the specific beliefs and cultural contexts that had shaped abusive behavior, rather than imposing intervention models designed primarily for mainstream American perpetrators with different cultural reference points. The housing program established by Sanctuary for Immigrant Survivors to address the particular challenges faced by immigrant women leaving abusive relationships provided not only immediate safe shelter, but also longer-term transitional housing with culturally appropriate support services, recognizing that rebuilding independent lives required both practical resources and cultural navigation assistance that mainstream domestic violence services often failed to provide. The program's success in helping women achieve stability and independence after leaving abuse demonstrated the importance of culturally informed approaches that addressed both universal needs for safety and specific challenges related to immigration status, language barriers, employment restrictions, and disrupted cultural and family connections. The international attention that Aisha's case received prompted examination of how globalization and migration were creating new contexts for domestic violence that crossed national boundaries and jurisdictions, with particularly complex dynamics in arranged marriages, where families in countries of origin maintained significant influence over relationships while having limited understanding of the legal, social, and practical realities facing couples in destination countries. This transnational dimension highlighted the need for international cooperation in addressing domestic violence, including better communication between legal systems, improved resources for women navigating unfamiliar cultural and legal environments, and development of support networks that bridged national boundaries to provide culturally relevant assistance to women experiencing abuse in diaspora contexts. The psychological research that emerged from clinical work with survivors like Aisha contributed to enhanced understanding of cultural aspects of trauma and recovery, documenting how cultural factors shaped both experiences of abuse and pathways to healing in ways that required adaptation of standard therapeutic approaches. This research highlighted the importance of addressing collective dimensions of identity and well-being rather than focusing exclusively on individual psychology, recognizing that for women from collectivist cultural backgrounds, healing required attention to family relationships, community belonging, spiritual connections, and cultural identity alongside individual trauma symptoms, necessitating therapeutic approaches that bridged Western individualistic models with more collectivist frameworks. The educational impact of Aisha's story extended beyond formal programs to influence broader cultural narratives about immigrant women, challenging stereotypes of passive victimhood through her demonstration of remarkable resilience, agency, and eventual leadership in community change efforts. Her public advocacy, conducted with careful attention to protecting her privacy and well-being, helped transform public perception of domestic violence in immigrant communities, from a problem attributed primarily to cultural difference toward understanding it as a manifestation of universal patterns of power and control that required culturally informed but universally applicable responses based on fundamental human rights to safety, dignity, and freedom from violence, regardless of cultural background. The 3-year mark after Aisha's assault coincided with a significant legal victory as the Florida legislature passed the Cultural Competency in Domestic Violence Response Act, legislation she had advocated for that mandated specialized training for police, prosecutors, judges, and service providers on addressing domestic violence in diverse cultural communities, while establishing minimum standards for language access, cultural consultation, and appropriate support services. The passage of this legislation represented formal recognition that effective response to domestic violence required systems capable of serving diverse populations with awareness of both universal dynamics of abuse and specific cultural factors that shaped victims' experiences, options, and barriers to safety. The international partnerships that developed between women's organizations in Florida, India, and several Middle Eastern countries established new protocols for transnational safety planning that addressed the particular challenges faced by women in international marriages, including coordination between service providers across national boundaries, development of resources for women considering returning to countries of origin after experiencing abuse abroad, and improved information sharing about potential abusers with histories of violence who sought new partners through international arrangements. These collaborative efforts recognize the globalized nature of modern marriage markets and the need for protection systems that functioned across national boundaries rather than being confined to single jurisdictions. The psychological framework developed by trauma specialists, working with immigrant survivors like Aisha, conceptualized recovery as requiring cultural identity integration, rather than forcing choices between cultural loyalty, personal safety, helping women navigate the complex process of maintaining valued aspects of cultural heritage while rejecting harmful beliefs or practices that had enabled abuse. This approach recognized that effective healing for women from traditional backgrounds often required addressing cultural dimensions of identity and belonging alongside individual trauma symptoms, creating therapeutic spaces where women could explore questions of cultural adaptation, selective tradition maintenance, and development of bicultural identities that incorporated both heritage values and new perspectives developed through their experiences in American contexts. The Specialized Legal Advocacy Program, established by immigrant rights organizations in partnership with domestic violence services, provided critical support for women navigating the intersection of family court, criminal proceedings, immigration processes, and civil litigation that often characterized cases involving immigrant victims of domestic violence. This comprehensive legal support recognized that immigration status, cultural factors, and language barriers created particular challenges in legal systems, primarily designed for English-speaking citizens with familiar understanding of American legal processes, providing both representation and education that empowered women to make informed choices while accessing all available legal protections, regardless of cultural background or immigration status. The evolving perspective within Tampa's diverse cultural communities included growing recognition of how traditional concepts of family privacy and conflict resolution that might have functioned adequately within close-knit communities of origin often failed to provide adequate protection when transplanted to diaspora contexts, where traditional community oversight and intervention mechanisms were weakened or absent. This recognition prompted development of new community accountability systems that maintained cultural approaches to problem-solving while establishing clear boundaries around behaviors considered unacceptable regardless of cultural context, creating culturally appropriate but effective responses to abuse that didn't rely exclusively on either American legal systems or traditional approaches that might prove inadequate in transnational contexts. The documentary film that eventually told Aisha's story, produced with her careful collaboration and consent, became an important educational tool used in training programs for service providers, community education efforts, and international advocacy. The film's nuanced approach, avoiding both cultural stereotyping and cultural relativism while documenting both universal patterns of domestic violence and specific cultural factors that shaped Aisha's experience, provided a powerful educational resource that humanized issues often discussed in abstract policy terms, helping viewers understand the lived reality of navigating cultural expectations, immigration challenges, and intimate partner violence simultaneously. The economic empowerment programs developed specifically for immigrant survivors addressed the financial dependency that often trapped women in abusive relationships, particularly when immigration status restrictions, limited employment options, educational credentials from countries of origin were not recognized by American employers, and women lacked credit histories or financial resources independent of abusive partners. These programs combined practical assistance with microloans, credential evaluation, career counseling, and small business development support specifically designed to address the economic challenges faced by immigrant women rebuilding lives after leaving abusive relationships, recognizing financial independence as a crucial foundation for long-term safety and well-being. The cultural adaptation visible in Tampa's diverse immigrant communities 3 years after the high-profile case included evolution of marriage practices, with increasing emphasis on ensuring that young women had opportunities to develop independent relationships with potential spouses, rather than relying entirely on family evaluation, along with more explicit pre-marriage discussions about expectations regarding gender roles, decision-making, and personal autonomy. These adaptations represented not wholesale abandonment of cultural traditions, but thoughtful evolution that maintained valued aspects of cultural heritage, while incorporating greater protection for individual well-being and recognition of the different contexts that shaped relationships in diaspora settings compared to communities of origin. The ongoing criminal justice process included Omar al-Hussein's appeal of his conviction, which ultimately failed when appellate courts rejected arguments that cultural context should have been given greater weight as a mitigating factor, reinforcing the principle that while cultural background might be relevant for understanding behavior, it did not constitute legal justification for violence that would be criminal, regardless of the perpetrator's cultural origin. This legal precedent strengthened protection for all victims by establishing that cultural background could not be used to create different standards of accountability or protection based on victims' cultural communities, ensuring equal application of laws against domestic violence, regardless of cultural context. The systematic changes in how arranged marriages were conducted within Tampa's South Asian community reflected lessons learned from Aisha's case, with increasing emphasis on thorough background checks of potential spouses, extended periods of direct communication between prospective partners before marriage, pre-marriage counseling, addressing expectations and potential challenges, and careful consideration of power dynamics created by immigration sponsorship. These adaptations represented thoughtful cultural evolution rather than rejection of traditional approaches to marriage, maintaining valued aspects of family involvement and cultural continuity, while incorporating greater protection against potential abuse through enhanced information sharing, more gradual relationship development, and explicit attention to power imbalances that could create vulnerability. The 5-year anniversary of Ayesha Varma's assault marked her transition from survivor to recognized expert on culturally informed responses to domestic violence, with her appointment to the governor's task force on immigrant safety and subsequent publication of influential guidelines for healthcare providers on culturally appropriate screening and intervention for domestic violence in diverse populations. Her professional journey from victim to advocate to policy expert illustrated the potential for transformation of trauma into expertise when survivors received appropriate support. With her unique combination of lived experience and professional education, creating particularly valuable perspective on systems that often failed to serve diverse populations effectively. The legislative achievements resulting from advocacy by Ayesha and other immigrant survivors included state-level provisions, enhancing language access in courts and service agencies, establishing cultural consultant positions within domestic violence response systems, and requiring consideration of immigration-related power dynamics in family court custody decisions where domestic violence had been documented. These policy changes reflected growing recognition that effective response to domestic violence required systems capable of serving diverse populations, with particular attention to barriers faced by immigrant women, including language differences, unfamiliarity with American legal systems, and vulnerabilities created by immigration status dependencies. The educational impact of Ayesha's case extended to professional training programs across multiple disciplines, with case studies based on her experience incorporated into curricula for police academies, medical schools, social work programs, and legal education throughout Florida, and eventually beyond state boundaries. These educational materials highlighted the intersection of universal patterns of domestic violence with specific cultural factors that shaped both victims' experiences and effective intervention strategies, preparing future professionals to respond effectively to domestic violence cases involving cultural complexity without either cultural stereotyping or cultural relativism that might compromise victim safety. The international collaboration between women's organizations in the United States and South Asia that emerged partly in response to Ayesha's case established new protocols for transnational safety planning that addressed the particular challenges faced by women in international marriages, including coordination between service providers across national boundaries, the development of resources for women considering returning to countries of origin after experiencing abuse abroad, and improved information sharing about potential abusers with histories of violence who sought new partners through international arrangements. These collaborative efforts recognize the globalized nature of modern marriage markets and the need for protection systems that functioned across national boundaries. The cultural evolution visible within Tampa's diverse immigrant communities 5 years after the case included significant shifts in how domestic violence was discussed and addressed, with religious and community leaders taking more active roles in prevention efforts, support for survivors, and clear condemnation of abuse justified through distortions of cultural or religious traditions. This evolution represented not abandonment of cultural identity, but thoughtful adaptation that preserved valued aspects of heritage while rejecting harmful elements, demonstrating how communities could maintain cultural continuity while adapting to new contexts and incorporating enhanced protection for vulnerable members. The psychological research emerging from clinical work with survivors like Ayesha contributed to development of culturally integrated trauma treatment, approaches that addressed both universal aspects of trauma recovery, specific cultural dimensions that shaped both experiences of abuse and pathways to healing. These therapeutic models recognize the importance of addressing collective dimensions of identity alongside individual psychology for survivors from collectivist cultural backgrounds, helping women navigate complex processes of maintaining valued aspects of cultural heritage while rejecting harmful beliefs or practices that enabled abuse, rather than forcing false choices between cultural loyalty and personal safety. The Economic Empowerment Program, established specifically for immigrant survivors, addressed the financial dependency that often trapped women in abusive relationships, particularly when immigration status restrictions, limited employment options, or educational credentials from countries of origin were not recognized by American employers. This program combined practical assistance with credential evaluation, career counseling, microloans for small business development, and partnerships with employers willing to provide opportunities for survivors rebuilding their lives, recognizing financial independence as a crucial foundation for long-term safety and well-being that required addressing the specific economic challenges faced by immigrant women. The systematic improvements in how arranged marriages were conducted within Tampa's South Asian community reflected lessons learned from Aisha's case, with increasing emphasis on thorough background checks of potential spouses, extended periods of direct communication between prospective partners before marriage, pre-marriage counseling, addressing expectations and potential challenges, and careful consideration of power dynamics created by immigration sponsorship. These adaptations represented thoughtful cultural evolution rather than rejection of traditional approaches to marriage, maintaining valued aspects of family involvement while incorporating greater protection through enhanced information sharing, more gradual relationship development, and explicit attention to power imbalances. The media coverage examining the 5-year impact of the case documented significant improvements in community response to domestic violence, with increased reporting of abuse from immigrant communities, enhanced cooperation between cultural organizations and domestic violence services, and development of culturally specific support resources that address the particular needs of survivors from diverse backgrounds. This progress demonstrated how a single high-profile case could catalyze broader systemic change when community leaders, service providers, and survivors work together to translate crisis response into sustainable improvements in prevention, intervention, and support systems that serve diverse populations effectively. The personal journey that Aisha described in occasional public appearances and carefully selected media interviews revealed both ongoing challenges and remarkable resilience as she navigated complex relationships with her family in India, who gradually moved from disapproval of her decisions toward tentative reconciliation, built a fulfilling career focused on helping other vulnerable women, and eventually developed capacity for new intimate relationships despite the trauma she had experienced. Her story powerfully contradicted stereotypes about passive victimhood through her demonstration of agency, leadership, and eventual ability to transform personal tragedy into professional expertise and advocacy that benefited countless other women facing similar challenges. The national recognition of Tampa's innovative approaches to addressing domestic violence in diverse communities came 5 years after Aisha's case, with the Cultural Bridge Initiative receiving federal funding to develop training materials and implementation guides that could help other communities replicate successful models of culturally informed prevention, intervention, and survivor support. This recognition reflected the initiative's demonstrated success in increasing reporting of abuse from immigrant communities, improving service utilization by diverse populations, and developing effective partnerships between cultural organizations and domestic violence services that enhanced both prevention efforts and support for survivors from various cultural backgrounds. 7 years after the assault that nearly claimed her life, Aisha Varma stood before an international conference on gender-based violence in Washington, D.C., sharing insights from both her personal experience and professional expertise on culturally informed approaches to prevention, intervention, and survivor support that had emerged partly in response to her case. Her presence at the podium composed, articulate, and visibly confident despite the permanent facial scarring that served as physical reminder of the violence she had survived, represented powerful testimony to the human capacity for resilience, transformation of trauma into expertise, and reclamation of dignity and agency after experiencing devastating abuse that had been partly justified through distortions of cultural traditions she still valued, despite their exploitation by her abuser. The systematic improvements in domestic violence response that had been implemented in Tampa following Aisha's case were being studied and adapted by communities across the country, with particular attention to the Cultural Bridge Initiative's successful model of partnership between domestic violence services, cultural organizations, and religious leaders that had dramatically increased both prevention efforts and support utilization in diverse immigrant communities. The initiative's success in demonstrating that cultural respect and victim safety could be complementary rather than competing priorities had transformed approaches to domestic violence in multicultural contexts, replacing models that either ignored cultural factors entirely or accepted cultural relativism that compromised victim protection with nuanced approaches that acknowledged cultural complexity while maintaining universal standards regarding unacceptable violence. The lasting impact of Aisha Varma's case extended far beyond her individual experience to catalyze broader social change, demonstrating how a single incident, when properly understood and addressed, could lead to systematic improvements in how communities recognized and responded to domestic violence across cultural contexts. Her legacy lived on through the lives of women who found safety, support, and pathways to healing through improved systems that might not have existed without the difficult but ultimately transformative public reckoning with the dangerous intersection of cultural expectations, gender inequality, and intimate partner violence that her case had forced. The changes inspired by her experience stood as powerful testimony to the potential for individual trauma, when courageously shared and thoughtfully addressed, to become catalyst for collective healing and social transformation that protected other vulnerable women from similar suffering.